Welcome to The Debate. Today we're wrestling with a set of texts that feel, at first glance, like they're completely upside down. We're looking at a collection of biblical commentaries by Marie-Noël Thibaut, specifically curated on Thierry Gellas's blog. Now, these readings are for what's called the fourth Sunday in Ordinary Time. But don't let that ordinary title fool you. The readings from Zephaniah, Corinthians, and the Gospel of Matthew present a worldview that is, well, it's anything but ordinary. They suggest a reality where the weak conquer the strong and the foolish, shame the wise.
And that's exactly where the trouble starts for me. We're looking at source material that insists on favoring the weak, the foolish, and the humble. So the central question for us today is, does this represent a comforting promise of liberation, like the commentary argues? Or does it present a radical, maybe even a dangerous subversion of human competence? I mean, does this material ask us to deny the value of human strength and agency? Because when I read it, I see a tension that, well, it isn't easily resolved.
That is the core tension. I represent the perspective that these texts, as Salvat analyzes them, present a coherent and, I'd say, necessary theology of liberation. My argument is that true freedom is found in what the text calls poverty of heart, and that this reliance on the divine is not a weakness, but really the only path to genuine joy and justice.
And I take the opposing view. When you actually strip away the poetic language and look at the texts provided, Zephaniah's anger, Paul's dismissal of wisdom, the Beatitudes' praise of weeping, I argue we are seeing a really jarring inversion of values. It risks romanticizing suffering and dismissing human reason in favor of a divine foolishness that it's very difficult to reconcile with a functional modern society. It essentially asks, is being competent a sin?
Okay, let's dive straight into the history then, because context is everything here. Thierry Gellas, in his curation, he emphasizes this theme of liberty throughout the readings. But to understand that liberty, we have to understand the threat. We start with the prophet Zephaniah. The book places us in a very specific and very dark moment in history.
Right, and this is where the realism usually gets lost in these kinds of discussions. Thibaut notes that Zephaniah is, quote, very angry and issues terrible threats against Jerusalem. But why is he so angry? The historical context provided is the expansion of the Assyrian Empire. And this wasn't just a neighbor dispute. Assyria was the superpower of the day. They were brutal, efficient, overwhelming. The kings of Judah at the time, Manasseh and Amon, they had submitted to Assyria, they paid tribute, they adopted Assyrian customs.
Exactly. And Thibaut points out that the prophet Zephaniah just explodes onto the scene with a message of wrath. He describes a day of the Lord, which, it sounds terrifying, a day of destruction. But Thibaut argues this wrath is surgical. It is directed solely at evil. The goal isn't annihilation, it's purification. What remains after this fire is what the text calls a remnant of Israel. And these are the people who refuse to commit injustice or speak lies. Thibaut frames this as a message of profound hope. God is presented as the Goel, or the Reshator, the Redeemer, the Avenger, who acts as the closest relative to the oppressed to buy back their freedom.
I see why you frame it as hope, but let's look at the cost of that hope. Thibaut acknowledges that the kings of Judah capitulated to Assyria not necessarily out of cowardice, but out of what she calls political realism. She writes, when one is a very small people, one cannot avoid being dominated by greater ones. And after all, it is a lesser evil rather than disappearing completely. That is the logic of survival. The kings were pragmatists. They were trying to stop their people from being wiped off the map. Zephaniah, on the other hand, he seems to be demanding a theological purity that just ignores geopolitical reality. He condemns the proud, who navigate these waters, and praises the humble, who just trust. It feels like reckless idealism to me.
It is very clear on what that pragmatism actually cost them. It wasn't just paying taxes. She points out that political alliances inevitably led to religious and cultural contamination. Accepting Assyrian tutelage meant accepting their gods, their customs, even their contract law. She notes that archaeologists have actually found commercial contracts regarding Jews written in Assyrian, so effectively under Assyrian law.
Which makes sense if you're an occupied state. You follow the rules of the occupier to keep the peace.
But the price was their soul. That is Zephaniah's point. By trying to survive through human maneuvering, they were ceasing to be Israel. They were becoming just another vassal state of the empire. Thabit argues that the remnant, this group of survivors, are those who realize that if you lose your identity to save your skin, you've lost everything. And this brings us to the definition of humility, or the anavim. This is a crucial linguistic insight in the material.
I did find the linguistics interesting, I have to say, even if I disagree with the application. Thembut breaks down the word anavim.
Yes, the root is humus, meaning earth or soil. It's the same root as our word human. So humility in this context isn't self-hatred or having low self-esteem. It is simply acknowledging reality, that we humans are dust. We are of the earth. The anavim, often translated as the poor or the humble, are literally the curved ones.
The curved ones. It's an evocative image, I'll give you that.
It is. It describes those who are bowed down by the weight of life or oppression. But Thabit flips the script. She argues that these curved ones are the only ones standing on solid ground because they aren't relying on the illusion of political power. The proud were the ones who thought they could outsmart the Assyrian Empire. The humble were those who refused to bow to the cultural hegemony of the conqueror, even if it meant being marginalized.
But look at how the prophet polices that refusal to bow. Thabut mentions Zephaniah 1:8, where God threatens those who dress in the foreign fashion. It seems incredibly controlling. The commentary tries to soften this by saying codes of dress were more important back then, which is true, but it underscores my point. The humility required here looks a lot like isolationism. It's a total rejection of the outside world, a rejection of modernity in favor of an insular reliance on God. It's a stance that views cultural adaptation as betrayal. I mean, that isn't just humility. It's a refusal to engage with the complexity of the world. If you follow Zephaniah's logic, you end up in a bunker, purely religious, but completely disconnected from the mechanism of the world.
I would frame it differently. It's not about refusing complexity. It's about maintaining integrity in the face of a culture that wants to absorb you. It's about knowing who you are. But I want to pivot because if you think Zephaniah is radical, the Gospel of Matthew takes this paradox and just amplifies it to a breaking point. We have the Beatitudes. Heureux, happy or blessed are the poor, the meek, and those who mourn.
Right, and this is the scandal I really wanted to address. Thabit herself admits that the phrase, heureux ceux qui pleurent, happy are those who weep, is, quote, the most difficult. It defies all logic. It's cognitively dissonant. How can weeping be a state of happiness? If we take this text at face value, it seems to be validating misery. If the kingdom belongs to those who mourn, are we supposed to seek out suffering? It seems to suggest that happiness is found in the very things humans naturally and rightly avoid. Poverty, hunger, persecution.
I'm not convinced by that validation of misery argument because it ignores the distinction Thabit makes regarding the life of Jesus himself. She explicitly states that Jesus spent his life healing suffering. He cured the sick, fed the hungry, raised the dead. He cannot be promoting suffering as a good in itself, or he would be working against his own mission. It would be a complete contradiction.
Then how do you explain the text, blessed are those who mourn? It is right there.
The Thabit clarifies that the tears mentioned here are specific. She suggests they're either tears of repentance, she cites Peter weeping after his denial, or tears of compassion. She references a really powerful image from Ezekiel 9:4, where God marks those who lament the abominations committed in the city. To weep in this sense is to have a heart that is not hardened. It's to be alive to the pain of the world rather than indifferent to it. That sensitivity, that is a form of happiness because it means you are still human, still connected to God. The hardened heart might feel less pain, but it's dead.
That is a very charitable, a very theological reading, but I'm looking at the structure of the text. It remains
upside down. The Beatitudes list the poor, the persecuted, the hungry as the privileged citizens of the kingdom. Thabit notes that humans generally pursue happiness through a specific triad: having, power, and knowing. Those are the drivers of civilization. We want to have resources, we want the power to control our environment, and we want to know how the world works. The Beatitudes attack that triad directly. It says the happy ones are those who don't have power, and who are persecuted. It fundamentally contradicts the human drive for security and success. Even if you spin the tears as compassion, you can't escape that this text valorizes a position of weakness. It tells the successful person that they are doing it wrong.
It is a reversal. I absolutely agree. But Thabit brings in a translation detail that I think changes the entire texture of the passage. She cites the translation by Andrei Shuraki.
The En Marche translation?
Yes. Shuraki translates heureux, happy, blessed, not as a static state, but as en marche, on the move, or you are on the right track.
It's poetic, certainly. But does it solve the problem?
Well, I think it's more than poetic. It's directional. It changes the meaning from, it is good that you are suffering, to, you who are poor in heart, you are on the right road. And why? Because you aren't weighed down by the superfluous. The Bajtur argues that those filled with having, power, and knowing are often blocked from seeing God because they are too full of themselves. The poor in heart have stripped away the artificial to find the real. So it's a compliment to those who travel light. It implies that if you're too full of your own success, you can't move forward spiritually.
Traveling light is a nice metaphor, but let's look at where that road leads in the reading from 1 Corinthians. This brings us to the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of men. If the Beatitudes question our pursuit of happiness, Paul questions our pursuit of excellence. The text states explicitly that God chose what is not to reduce to nothing what is.
It's a dismantling of status, yes.
It's deeper than status. Paul writes that God chose the foolish to cover the wise with confusion. This suggests a divine hostility toward human capability. Paul tells the Corinthians to look at themselves. Not many wise, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. It reads like a condemnation of success. If I'm a scientist, a leader, a scholar, someone who has worked hard to cultivate wisdom and strength, this text seems to say my achievements are actually obstacles, or worse, folly in the eyes of God. It devalues human competence. It feels like God is insecure about human achievement.
It is only hostility if you are attached to those titles as your source of ultimate worth. Thabit clarifies this with a comparison to the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee was wise and righteous. He did everything right. He was the successful religious man. But he was full of himself. He was a closed loop. The goal of this text isn't to destroy human capacity. Paul himself was an incredibly learned man, but to prevent pride, specifically glorying before God.
But why frame it as folly? Why create this antagonism between reason and faith?
But Thabit frames it as a clash between two logics, the logic of reasoning versus the logic of love. Human wisdom relies on reasoning, which is necessarily limited by what we can observe and measure. God's wisdom is love, which is infinite. So the text isn't anti-intellectual. It's recognizing that human logic is too narrow to grasp the folly of God's love. A purely rational person might say, it is illogical to forgive your enemy. The logic of love says, forgive them anyway. That looks like foolishness to the world, but Thabit argues it is a higher wisdom.
The folly of the love of God is completely inaccessible to the narrowness of our reasoning. That is the quote, and it sounds profound, but practically it sounds like a license to be irrational. If God's wisdom is the inverse of human wisdom, then are we supposed to be foolish? Are we supposed to be incompetent? If I'm building a bridge, I want the engineer to use the logic of reasoning, not the logic of love. It implies that competence itself is suspect. I worry that this theology encourages people to abandon critical thinking.
No, it suggests that competence is not salvation. That is a crucial difference. You can build the bridge, but don't worship the bridge, and don't worship your own brain for designing it. Thabit notes that the only true title of nobility for the Christian is baptism.
God creates a new world where social standing, whether you are a genius or a simpleton, doesn't determine your value. This is the ultimate leveling field. It's not that you can't be wise or powerful, but that those things don't get you any closer to the logic of love. As Thabit quotes Jeremiah, "Let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, but let him who boasts boast of this, that he understands and knows me."
I see the distinction you're making, but the tension remains for me. It demands a humbling, that it borders on humiliation. It strips away everything we usually use to define ourselves. And this brings us back to Theodore Gilles' focus: liberty. Gilles highlights these texts because he believes they speak to freedom. Tharbet notes that the biblical law regarding widows, orphans, and strangers had one goal: to make Israel a free people respectful of the liberty of others.
Which is a beautiful definition of law. It's law designed to protect the vulnerable.
It is. But I have to ask, the text demands total submission to God. The remnant in Zephaniah takes refuge only in God's name. They abandon political alliances, they abandon cultural integration. Is total dependence truly freedom? Or is it just a different form of servitude? You're trading a human master, the Assyrians, or the market economy, for a divine one. And in the process, you are stripping yourself of the tools, wealth, power, wisdom that usually guarantee autonomy in the real world. A person with money and power has options. A person who's poor in heart and dependent on God has faith. That feels like a precarious kind of liberty.
I think that is the paradox the material wants us to grapple with. My argument, and Thabit's argument, is that liberation from idols is the only true freedom. When you rely on money or political alliances, you are enslaved by them. You have to maintain them, protect them, and eventually you compromise your ethics to keep them. Just like the kings of Judah did. They became slaves to their own survival strategy.
So the argument is that having nothing to lose makes you free?
In a sense, yes. The yoke of the Beatitudes, the poverty of heart, is actually the path to being unencumbered. Thabit says the goal of the law was to make a people who were artisans of peace. You cannot be an artisan of peace if you are busy defending your power, your status, and your wealth. The dependence on God is what frees you from the rat race of human hierarchy. It's the freedom of not having to be the best or the strongest.
It is a beautiful ideal, I will grant you that. But it remains a hard saying. We're left with a worldview that offers deep consolation to the marginalized, the blind, the hungry, the curved ones. For them, this is undeniably good news. It tells them their suffering isn't the end of the story. But for the successful, the self-sufficient, the wise of this world, people who likely make up a good chunk of our audience, this text is a warning, if not a threat. The day of wrath in Zephaniah and the demand to become small act as barriers. It asks the capable person to admit that, ultimately, they are dust. And that is a psychological leap that it just defies modern logic.
And I would say that is exactly the point. The good news described here is that God uses human weakness as the raw material for the kingdom. Thabit concludes that by admitting one is dust, by embracing that humus, that humility, one is raised up. It's not about destroying the strong, but about revealing that strength without love is hollow. It invites the strong to lay down their armor.
We've looked at Zephaniah's angry protection of identity, the scandal of the Beatitudes, and the tears that might be happiness, and Paul's inversion of wisdom. It is certainly not a comfortable set of texts.
No, they aren't comfortable, but they ask us to change our gaze. They ask us to look at the world not through human hierarchies of power, but through a lens where the curved ones are the ones standing tallest.
Whether that inversion is a path to liberty or a denial of reality is something our listeners will have to decide for themselves. Are you the wise of this world or the remnant of Israel?
Thank you for listening to The Debate.